Welcome back to another Spirit Island video. In this video, we're going to continue our Towering Roots guide. This video is going to focus on board selection. Now, before we start looking at the different boards, I want to review the cards because that is critical to how Roots is going to play on the boards. So, Blooming of Rocks and Trees, this is going to allow us to place Vitality at 1 range. Now, when we factor in our special rule, this will increase to 2 range, and that's going to be very, very critical. Radiant and Hallowed Grove. This is a power card that's going to target our Incarna land. It will target the Incarna land and will affect an adjacent land. Entwine the Fates of All. This is a fast power targeting a player in one of target spirit's lands. Defend 2 per presence. This is essentially a 0 range defend, and this is really key to our presence placement puzzle. And finally, Boon of Resilient Power. This is going to allow us to restore a destroyed presence, which is going to help maneuver our Incarna, but also could allow us to add presence back to buffer our defend. Looking at our special rule on the left, or our left innate, we have Shelter Under Towering Branches. This is a 0 range slow power that gets +1 range from our special rule. And finally, Revoke Sanctuary. This is going to be a Sacred Site power targeting our Incarna. Now, let's look at the boards. Now, it probably shouldn't surprise you that board E is one of the best boards in the game for Towering Roots. And the reason for that, well, there's actually a lot of reasons, but let's actually first copy and paste this because I had forgotten to do that. There we go. All right. So why is board E the best Towering Roots board? And this is, if you're struggling with this spirit, definitely this is the board to pick. This is playing Roots on easy mode just because it does so much for the spirit. Okay, first, your Incarna is starting in a town land that gives you a target for your turn 1 remove a town explorer. You don't need to get cute with your G3 moving the Incarna. It's already right where you need it to be. In addition, your starting Incarna land is going to be adjacent to 5 lands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that is one of the most among the starting Incarna positions. I think only board A is the only other board where you start against, yes, so it's just board A, and it looks like board C, you have a lot of adjacencies. But yes, so board E, you have the most starting adjacencies. In addition, your presence are going to be in lands with 3 Dahan, which means you're already set up nicely for those Dahan events. And since we're a spirit that struggles to move Dahan, we're going to want to have presence in lands with Dahan. Like, we don't want to move Dahan into our presence lands. It's going to be very hard to do that. So starting inlands with Dahan is going to be easier to utilize our Entwine the Fates of All. In addition, you have 2 Dahan here on E3 that can cover your E3 land, so you just have to put a single presence there to grow in that land. And it's also it's very easy to pair up your other 2 Dahan, either gathering your E1 Dahan to E5 or your E5 Dahan into E1. You're right next to your Blighted Land, so if you need to deal with that Blighted Land early on, you can easily pull stuff out, or you can hit it with your Radiant and Hallowed Grove. And as you guys have probably seen from my previous videos, board E is one of the best boards to pocket. As soon as this town is removed, you'll cut off lands E8 and E6, and that can put you very far ahead. Now I have these red dots. These red dots are going to, they're going to point out areas on the board where things can get kind of problemsome for us. So with board E, if our starting Incarna is on E7, the problem land is going to be on E2. And the reason why E2 is going to be problematic is because it's hard for us to get Dahan into that land, because the only way to gather Dahan is via a sacred site. In addition, our Incarna can't actually deal with that land because it's too far away, so we can't use our left innate to pull anything away. Now, fortunately, our Blooming of Rocks and Trees, because we're on board E, we can actually use this card to hit any land on our board. So we can actually use Blooming to put Vitality in E2 whenever we get into a problematic situation. Now, we will have to watch out maybe Russia or England, because E2 can build up really quickly or can get a lot of explorers. So we have to be extremely cautious in those matchups. Now, I have this, I'm colorblind, so I don't know if this is blue or purple, but I have this little arrow, and this is representing what I'm thinking about where I'm thinking about moving the tree this game. And e5, and the only reason I'd like to move to e5 is because now I can access that e2 nicely. I can then also access my e3 as well. The only thing I lose out on is I can no longer deal with my e6, but that's less important because one, there's a beast there, but two, there's it's not a coast. So the coast is likely to come up more frequently because there's a coast card, while inlands, you don't really have to worry about them that much. So ideally, I'm considering moving my Incarna to e5. Sometimes I move my Incarna to e2 or e1, but those are more England games where I need to get maximum use out of that right innate. But most of the time, I'm either going to stay between e7 and e5, depending on the game. Another thing that I like about board E is if I'm playing against Russia, I have a beast that starts in my land e8, and that's already a land with 2 Dahan and presence. So once I have to start escalating in that land, it won't be that big of a problem to just have the Dahan defend and counterattack the land to kill those explorers because they're already in that beast land. And that's something that you'll want to do. Dahan-based spirits want to have beasts in Dahan such that they can utilize this type of combo. And we have a presence there, so it's already easy to get a second presence and a third presence there to increase the defend. Now, ideally versus Russia, we would like to have a beast in our Incarna land so that we can just escalate there, but this is still a very solid board into Russia. This is also your best board into HME, and that's just because your big problematic land is on E7, and we're going to plan on empowering in that matchup. So having this land look like this to start the game, and then constantly getting larger is going to be great because we're going to put all of our vitality on this E7, and that will be able to deal with that land once the salt card comes later in the game. I'm trying to think if there's anything else to talk about here for this specific board. I mean, board E is your best board with roots. There's no real debate, no argument. It's just a very, very strong board. Okay, well, let's look at the next board. Boards in A tier. We have board F, B, and A. Now, these boards, they're good boards with roots. It's just there's a couple things that could become problems based on explorers, adversaries, stuff like that. I really like board F, and that's why I have that over here on the left. And that's just because you have 2 Dahan in F1, so it's very easy to get 3 or 4 Dahan into F1 to really deal with that. Your Incarna is centralized, once again, adjacent to 5 lands. And you can deal with 2 of your coast lands. Now, the weaknesses to board F is 1, this land on F7. You can't access it. You're not in your town land, so you won't be able to get rid of this town easy. And this space on F3 can also be very problematic if it comes up multiple times. Like if you're playing against Prussia, it looks like this. And now you won't be able to fully defend this. If it blights, if it comes up again, then you'll have to cascade into E2 because your E4 has a blight already. Now I like board F because you're right next to this this blighted land here. When thinking about moving the Incarna, a lot of times I end up moving it to E2 just because I get access to E3 and now I can fully control my E3 land. And E2 tends to have a lot of buildings. You could get a little, what's the word? Creative and move your Incarna over here to F4. And this will actually, it has the same amount of adjacencies as where you start the game off, but now you can access F3 and F7, which is really nice. And now you lose access to F1 and F6, but F1 and F6 have Dahan, so you can just plan on using Dahan defense to solve these lands. The only problem with moving over here is if you ever have to emergency put a vitality in your Incarna land, you can't because there's blight here. Or if you use the growth option, you can, but then it won't work because there's blight here. I really like board F versus England just because like both of these lands tend to be the lands with all of the buildings. And like I said, you can easily get a lot of Dahan into your F1. And then if your wetland comes up like on F7, sometimes I might move over here to F7 and then play Radiant to just immediately kill that Explorer. Okay, looking at board B. So board B, we're already going to start having some problems. As you can see, our starting Incarna is very far away from B2 and B3. So if I want to be playing Blooming, I can't actually use Blooming to add Vitality to those lands. Board F and board E, as you guys can see, the starting Incarna can using blooming to hit the whole board. Well, board B, you cannot. Now I have some arrows showing movements of the Incarna. Sometimes board B, I like moving right to B6 so I can kill that town early on. Sometimes I move over here to B1 if it's like England, and this I'm going to make this land my big land with all of the buildings. And then if I'm in B1, I have adjacencies to B2, my blighted land B4, as well as B5 and B6. And then I have Dahan on B8 and B7 and B3 to kind of cover the lands far away from my Incarna. There's also that plan of moving your Incarna into B4. This is a very ideal space as well because now you have access to all Incarna lands, or not Incarna, all coastlands here. But it is in your blighted land, so it's a little bit trickier to cover that land. Another benefit to moving your Incarna to B6 is now you'll have access to use blooming on B2, which could be very advantageous for you. Okay, looking at board A here, a lot of similar problems to board B, in that your Incarna is really far away from the coast and you need to actually move it to access the coast. Now, the problem is if you want to move your Incarna, well, now you're no longer in your town land. So there's a little bit of that negative there where you kind of want to be able to utilize that right innate starting in that town land. But here you have this huge incentive to move the Incarna out such that you can vitality into your A2. So another small weakness to the board. In addition, your Dahan is in this A2, so there's chances that it can die to the first disease event, and you won't be able to save it. And you have this lone Dahan on A6. This board isn't terrible. I actually play a lot of games on board A. A lot of times I like moving my Incarna into A1, because then once again I'm right on that coast, so I can use my right innate to obliterate the land. I'm also adjacent to land 2. Another option is moving over here to A5, because now I'm more centralized where I can kind of deal with the whole board here. It's definitely the weakest board among the A tier boards. Looking at the next tier, we have B tier. These are boards that will really make your Roots games challenging, because you've really got to think outside the box with the Incarna movement and placement of things. So looking at board G here, you're going to start here in G7, and ideally I like moving my Incarna over here to G2, just because once I'm in G2, I'm going to have 5 adjacencies, so I can hit all of these different lands. Another idea could be to move over here to G6, and when you move to G6, then you'll be able to access this G8. The one negative to moving to G2 is you can no longer hit G8, and there's no Dahan there. But the benefit is you'll be able to handle your G2 very easily. If your Incarna is in G6, you can handle your G8 and your G2, but now you need to rely on Dahan to handle your G3 and G4. If I'm playing against Russia, I try to move my Incarna into G6 because there's a beast here. The beasts will be both on the jungle, so you can have your Incarna handle this land on G6. If I'm playing England, I like moving straight to G2, but it really depends. Looking at board C here, this is one of the weaker boards. You'll notice that all of your presents do not start in any lands with Dahan, so trying to get access to those Dahan events that I mentioned in the previous videos is going to be more challenging. If you look board G, you start in lands with 3 Dahan. Board E, you start with 3 Dahan. Board F, you start with 3. Board B, 3. Board A is only 1, but most likely you grow over here to A3. So board C, you start with 0 Dahan, which can be very problematic. Now, the big benefit with board C is you start with a beast in your Incarna land, so you can easily escalate Russia explorers into that land. But really, this board has just a lot of problems with it. As you can see, both of the red dots are problematic lands. Luckily, your Incarna starts right adjacent to C2, but really you want to move that Incarna over here to C7 in some matchups to kill this town such that you can create the pocket over here on C8. If you're playing against England, it can also be problematic because C1 tends to have a lot of buildings, and your Incarna isn't adjacent to C1, so getting Dahan to C1 could be difficult. Ideally, you'd like to move your Incarna over here to C6. Another idea could be to move your Incarna to C2. But really, it depends. I guess there should be one more arrow over here pointing to C2 as well. Um, the benefit of C6 is now you can actually access the C8. When you're on C2, you're basically giving up on C8 and on C7. But yes, board C, not really a good roots board, but it's better than the one down here. Looking at board H, this is another board where we're now only going to start with Dahan in one of our lands. Um, the problem I have with this board is it's so awkward where the Incarna starts. You start on the coast, which is very unique. It's the only board in the game where you start on the coast. And if you're playing against England, this is your city land. But then you have this Dahan over here, which is very awkward, and your Incarna is very far away from the blighted land. Ideally, I'd like to move my Incarna over here to H2 because then I can cover my blighted land, and then I can also cover my weak spot here on G3 or on H3, and then I can utilize Dahan to cover my H1 for me. I've done some weird maneuvers with the Roots Incarna where on this board where I'll move over here to H7, get rid of this town, and then plan on moving to H2 later in the game. And the idea is you get rid of the town early on, and then you can kind of create like a little bit of a pocket here. I've also done maneuvers where I move straight over here to H4 if it's like Russia or France, and then or like yeah, Russia or France, and then I can kill both explorers here and here with Radiant, stopping both builds. So there's some really cool things. And once again, don't just all because I have arrows on certain land types, don't think that you can't move your Incarna to other lands. This is just ideally what I'm thinking when I start the game. It's going to be very explore dependent, adversary dependent, stuff like that. Okay, looking at the final board here, we have board D, and this is just like very bad like board C. All of our starting presents do not start in lands with Dahan. In addition, moving our Incarna is just so awkward. Like ideally, I'd like to move over here to D4 because this would give me the most amount of adjacencies. But I don't have a starting presence there, so it's awkward to move there. And then if I move here, well, now I have no way of dealing with D8. I also don't have presence in either the D1 or D7, so defending these lands is going to be somewhat problematic. Now, I could move my Karna over here to D1, which gives me access to a lot of nice lands. But the problem with that is now I have two Dahan in my Incarna land, and ideally I don't want my Dahan in my Incarna land. So now I'm going to have to spend actions to move those Dahan out of the land such that they can handle lands where my Incarna is not. But board D is definitely the hardest board for roots. So if this is a spirit that you're struggling with, I would stay away from this board. Focus on any of the boards above. Like I said, board E is the easiest. F, B, and A, I tend to have really interesting games. A lot of cool puzzles of moving the Incarna around. G, C, and H tend to be more challenging, and then yeah, D is the worst. If you like this video, like, subscribe for more content. I will see you guys in the next video.